I watched in horror as Corinne stood over the wreckage of my ham radio antenna, her arms crossed in smug satisfaction. The twisted metal and severed cables lay scattered across my front yard like the remains of a fallen soldier. She had finally won her war against what she called my ugly eyesore. But as I stared at the destruction, my emergency radio crackled to life with a chilling message that made my blood run cold. All stations, all stations. This is emergency coordination. We have a confirmed tornado touchdown 15 miles southwest and moving directly toward residential areas. We need immediate communication support for search and rescue operations. I looked up at Corinne, still gloating over her victory. She had no idea what she had just done. In less than 30 minutes, our neighborhood would need every emergency communication link available to survive what was coming. And thanks to her, we had none. My name is David, and I have been a licensed amateur radio operator for 15 years. What most people do not understand about ham radio is that we are not just hobbyists playing with old technology. We are the backbone of emergency communications when everything else fails. When cell towers go down, when internet lines are cut, when power grids collapse under the weight of natural disasters, amateur radio operators step up. We become the vital link between isolated communities and emergency services. We coordinate rescue efforts, relay medical information, and sometimes we are the difference between life and death. That is why I spent months carefully planning my antenna installation. My property sits on a corner lot in Meadowbrook Estates, a quiet suburban neighborhood where most people worry more about lawn care than emergency preparedness. But I knew better. I had seen what happened during Hurricane Katrina, during the Moore tornado, during countless other disasters where amateur radio saved lives. I researched every regulation, every ordinance, every HOA bylaw before I installed my first antenna mast. The Federal Communications Commission grants amateur radio operators broad protection under federal preemption laws. These laws exist because emergency communications are a matter of life and death, not neighborhood aesthetics. My setup was modest but effective. A 40-foot tower with a multi-band antenna that could reach emergency coordinators across 3 counties. Solar panels and battery backup systems that would keep me operational even during extended power outages. A dedicated radio room in my basement where I could coordinate with disaster response teams 24 hours a day. I followed every rule. I obtained proper permits. I stayed within power limits. I positioned everything to minimize visual impact while maintaining operational effectiveness. My antenna was no different from the satellite dishes and security cameras that dotted every other rooftop in the neighborhood. For 2 years, my station operated flawlessly. I participated in weekly emergency nets, supported local charity events, and helped other amateur operators with technical questions. I was an active member of the County Emergency Services volunteer program, providing communication support during severe weather events and community emergencies. My neighbors seemed to appreciate having someone prepared for disasters. Mrs. Henderson from across the street often asked about emergency preparedness. Tom Rodriguez, who lived next door, was genuinely interested in learning about amateur radio. Even the local fire chief had visited my station and praised the community service we provided. The antenna was barely visible from most angles, tucked discreetly behind a grove of oak trees that bordered my property. It met all setback requirements and height restrictions. The only time anyone really noticed it was during the monthly emergency drills when I would test my equipment and coordinate with other stations. I thought I had found the perfect balance between effective emergency communications and good neighbor relations. I was wrong. Everything changed the day Corinne Phillips moved into the house diagonal from mine. She arrived like a storm front, immediately surveying the neighborhood with the sharp eyes of someone looking for problems to solve. Within her first week, she had joined the HOA board and begun what she called her Community Improvement Initiative. I should have seen the warning signs. The way she walked through the neighborhood with a notepad, photographing anything that caught her attention. The questions she asked about property values and maintaining standards. The meetings she organized to discuss neighborhood aesthetics. But I was focused on more important things. Storm season was approaching, and I was coordinating with emergency management officials to ensure our communication networks were ready. I had no idea that while I was preparing to save lives, Corinne Phillips was preparing to destroy everything I had built. Corinne Phillips was everything you would expect from a stereotypical HOA enforcer, but worse. She was a woman in her late 50s with perfectly styled gray hair and the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. She wore her authority like expensive jewelry, constantly displaying it for everyone to see. She introduced herself to me on a Tuesday morning while I was performing routine maintenance on my antenna system. I was adjusting the rotator when I heard her voice behind me. "Excuse me, are you the owner of this property?" I turned to see her standing at the edge of my driveway, arms crossed, studying my antenna tower like it was a crime scene. She wore a crisp white blouse and navy slacks, and carried a leather portfolio that she clutched like a weapon. "Yes, I am David Morrison. You must be my new neighbor. Welcome to Meadowbrook Estates." Her smile was as cold as winter morning. "I am Corinne Phillips, and I serve on the HOA board. I could not help but notice this rather large structure in your backyard. Is this some kind of commercial installation?" I explained that it was an amateur radio station, licensed by the FCC for emergency communications. I told her about the federal preemption laws that protect amateur radio installations. I mentioned my volunteer work with county emergency services. Corinne listened with the expression of someone who had already made up her mind. "Well, that may be true, but this is a residential neighborhood with strict aesthetic standards. This tower is clearly visible from the street and significantly impacts property values. Actually, the antenna meets all height restrictions and setback requirements. It is barely visible from most angles, and federal law protects amateur radio installations from local restrictions." Corinne's smile became even more frigid. "We shall see about that. I will be researching this matter thoroughly. The HOA has a responsibility to protect property values for all residents." Over the next few weeks, Corinne transformed from curious neighbor to relentless adversary. She began what could only be described as surveillance of my property. I would see her in the early morning, photographing my antenna from different angles. She measured distances from my tower to property lines. She documented every guy wire, every feed line, every piece of equipment. She started a campaign of misinformation that would have impressed any political operative. She told neighbors that my antenna was a commercial broadcast facility that violated zoning laws. She claimed it posed safety hazards to children and pets. She suggested it was decreasing everyone's property values by thousands of dollars. Corinne organized coffee meetings with other residents where she presented her evidence against my antenna. She created elaborate photo presentations showing my tower from every possible angle. She brought property value assessments that supposedly proved her point, though I later discovered these were based on false assumptions about my station. The first formal violation notice arrived on a Friday afternoon. It was written on official HOA letterhead and signed by 3 board members, including Karen. The notice claimed my antenna violated Article 7.3 of the community bylaws regarding unsightly structures and demanded its removal within 30 days. I immediately researched Article 7.3 and discovered it was a general provision about maintaining property appearance. It said nothing specific about amateur radio antennas, nor did it override federal preemption laws that protect emergency communications. I requested a hearing before the HOA board to present my case. I prepared a detailed presentation explaining federal amateur radio regulations, emergency communication needs, and the legal protections that applied to my installation. I gathered letters of support from emergency management officials and other amateur radio operators. The hearing was scheduled for the following month, but Karen was not waiting for due process. She escalated her harassment campaign, filing complaints with the city zoning office, the county planning department, and even the state attorney general. Every complaint was eventually dismissed, but each one required time and legal research to address. Karen also began personal attacks on my character and motives. She told neighbors I was that type of person who cared more about his hobby than community standards. She suggested I was being selfish and inconsiderate. She implied that amateur radio was outdated technology used by antisocial people who could not adapt to modern communications. The psychological pressure was intense. Every day brought new complaints, new threats, new attempts to undermine my position in the community. Karen had turned what should have been a simple regulatory matter into a personal war, and she seemed determined to win at any cost. But I knew something Karen did not understand. Emergency communications are not a hobby or a convenience. They are a matter of life and death, and storm season was approaching fast. Karen's crusade against my antenna entered a new phase of intensity that bordered on obsession. What started as aesthetic concerns had evolved into a full-scale legal and social warfare campaign that consumed increasingly more of my time and energy. The HOA hearing was a disaster. Karen had stacked the deck by recruiting 2 new board members who shared her views about property standards. She presented a 40-slide presentation complete with professional photographs, property value analyses, and legal opinions from an attorney who specialized in HOA enforcement. I countered with federal regulations, emergency communication needs, and legal precedents protecting amateur radio installations. I brought testimonials from emergency management officials who explained how amateur radio saves lives during disasters. I presented FCC documentation proving my station was fully compliant with all regulations. None of it mattered. The board voted 4-1 to uphold the violation notice and demanded removal of my antenna within 60 days. They imposed a daily fine of $50 that would begin if I failed to comply. Federal law clearly protects amateur radio installations from exactly this type of local restriction, I told them. Karen leaned forward with her predatory smile. Federal law is one thing, Mr. Morrison. Community standards are another. We have a responsibility to protect property values for everyone in this neighborhood. I appealed the decision and hired an attorney who specialized in amateur radio law. The legal fees began mounting immediately. My lawyer explained that while federal preemption law was clearly on my side, HOA disputes could drag on for years and cost tens of thousands of dollars. Meanwhile, Karen launched what could only be described as a propaganda campaign. She created a neighborhood newsletter that featured my antenna as the cover story under the headline, "Protecting Our Community Standards." She organized petition drives demanding my compliance with HOA rules. She held informational meetings where she presented her version of amateur radio as a dangerous and outdated hobby. Karen's most effective tactic was exploiting fear and ignorance. She told neighbors that amateur radio towers attracted lightning strikes that could damage their homes. She claimed my transmissions interfered with medical devices and garage door openers. She suggested that property values would plummet if the neighborhood became known for industrial communications facilities. Every claim was false or misleading, but Karen presented them with such confidence that many neighbors began to believe her. People who had previously supported my emergency preparedness efforts started avoiding me in the grocery store. Former friends stopped returning phone calls. The social isolation was perhaps worse than the legal battle. Karen had successfully turned me into a pariah in my own neighborhood. She accomplished this through a sophisticated campaign of character assassination that portrayed me as a selfish hobbyist who cared more about his toys than community welfare. But Karen made a critical mistake. In her zeal to destroy my amateur radio station, she pushed the HOA board to modify the community bylaws specifically targeting amateur radio installations. The new language was so broad and restrictive that it would effectively ban all amateur radio antennas regardless of federal protection laws. This gave my attorney the opening he needed. The modified bylaws were so clearly in violation of federal preemption law that we could challenge them directly in federal court. We filed a lawsuit seeking injunctive relief and damages for the violation of my rights under federal amateur radio regulations. Karen responded by escalating her personal attacks. She began spreading rumors about my family, my job, and my motivations for living in the neighborhood. She suggested I was planning to expand my antenna system into a commercial operation. She claimed I was using amateur radio as a cover for illegal activities. The legal battle consumed months and thousands of dollars. Depositions, court filings, expert witnesses, and legal briefs became my new reality. Every week brought new developments, new threats, and new attempts by Karen to undermine my case through procedural manipulation and delay tactics. The stress affected my entire family. My wife Sarah began avoiding neighborhood events where she might encounter Karen or her supporters. My teenage son stopped bringing friends home because he was embarrassed by the ongoing conflict. The house that had once been our sanctuary became a battlefield. Through it all, I maintained my amateur radio operations and continued my volunteer work with emergency services. But I could see the writing on the wall. Karen had superior resources, unlimited time, and the political support of the HOA board. She was winning through attrition and intimidation. The final blow came when Karen convinced the HOA to hire a private security company to monitor my property for compliance violations. They installed cameras aimed at my antenna system and began documenting every maintenance activity, every equipment test, and every visitor to my radio room. I was living under surveillance in my own neighborhood, treated like a criminal for maintaining equipment that could save lives during emergencies. Karen had created a totalitarian environment where federal law meant nothing and community aesthetics justified any level of harassment. But Karen had no idea what was about to happen. While she was busy destroying emergency communications infrastructure, nature was preparing to show her exactly why that infrastructure existed. The day Karen achieved her ultimate victory will be burned into my memory forever. It was a Thursday morning in late September, and the weather forecast showed a massive storm system developing in the Gulf of Mexico. Emergency management officials had already begun preliminary preparations for what meteorologists were calling a potentially catastrophic weather event. I was in my radio room conducting the weekly emergency communications net when I heard vehicles pulling into my driveway. Through the window, I could see Karen's silver Mercedes leading a convoy that included an HOA board member's car, a pickup truck from Phillips Demolition Company, and a white van from Neighborhood Security. My heart sank as I realized what was happening. The 60-day compliance deadline had expired, and Karen was here to personally oversee the destruction of my amateur radio station. I finished the emergency net and walked outside to confront the group assembling on my property. Karen stood in the center like a general surveying a battlefield, clipboard in hand, wearing her victory smile like a crown. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," she said with mock politeness. "I trust you received our final notice regarding compliance with community standards." "Karen, you cannot do this. Federal law protects amateur radio installations from local restrictions. This is illegal." Her laugh was sharp and cold. "Your federal law did not prevent the HOA board from voting unanimously to remove this unsightly structure. You have had months to comply voluntarily. Now we will handle the matter ourselves." The demolition crew began unloading their equipment while Karen supervised every detail. She had brought professional contractors who specialized in antenna removal, complete with proper safety equipment and disposal services. This was not a hasty decision or spontaneous action. Karen had planned this moment meticulously. "Please understand that you will be billed for all costs associated with this removal," Karen announced loudly enough for the gathering neighbors to hear. "The HOA takes property values and community standards very seriously." I watched in helpless rage as the contractors began disconnecting feed lines and guy wires from my carefully installed antenna system. Each severed connection represented months of work and thousands of dollars in equipment. More importantly, each cut cable reduced our neighborhood's emergency communication capability. "Do you have any idea what you are doing?" I asked Karen as the first antenna section was lowered to the ground. "This equipment provides emergency communications for 3 counties. You are literally destroying life safety infrastructure." Karen's expression did not change. "What I am doing, Mr. Morrison, is protecting the property values and aesthetic standards that every resident of this community has a right to expect. Your hobby does not override our community standards." The word hobby hit me like a slap. This was not a hobby. This was emergency preparedness. This was public service. This was the difference between life and death when disasters struck and conventional communications failed. But Karen saw only an eyesore that affected her view and her property values. She had no understanding of emergency communications, no appreciation for public service, and no concern for anything beyond her narrow definition of neighborhood aesthetics. The demolition took 3 hours. Karen supervised every minute, taking photographs and making notes for her records. She treated the destruction of emergency communications equipment like a public relations event, ensuring that other neighbors could witness her triumph over what she called selfish individualism. Several neighbors gathered to watch the spectacle. Some seemed uncomfortable with the aggressive tactics, but none spoke up in my defense. Karen had successfully isolated me from community support through months of propaganda and character assassination. As the contractors loaded my antenna sections into their truck, Karen approached me with her clipboard and a satisfied smile. I hope you understand that this was necessary for the good of the community. Sometimes individual desires must yield to collective standards. You have no idea what you have just done, I told her, my voice barely controlled. When the next emergency hits this area, people are going to need these communications. You just destroyed our neighborhood's connection to emergency services. Karen waved dismissively. We have cell phones and landlines, Mr. Morrison. We do not need your antiquated radio equipment to communicate with anyone. That statement revealed everything I needed to know about Karen's understanding of emergency communications. She lived in a fantasy world where modern infrastructure never failed, where disasters were minor inconveniences, and where emergency services were always available at the touch of a button. The contractors finished loading my equipment and drove away, leaving behind only scattered coaxial cable scraps and the concrete base that had anchored my tower. Corinne stayed behind to document the restoration of my property to community standards. I want you to know that this gives me no pleasure, she lied, still smiling. But sometimes we must make difficult decisions to protect what matters most. Property values and community aesthetics benefit everyone. As Corinne finally drove away in her Mercedes, I stood looking at the empty space where my antenna had provided emergency communications for over 2 years. The timing could not have been worse. Storm season was approaching its peak, and weather forecasters were tracking the most dangerous system in decades. But Corinne had gotten what she wanted. My eyesore was gone, property values were supposedly protected, and her vision of suburban perfection was restored. She had no idea that nature was about to deliver its own verdict on her priorities. The weather forecast became increasingly ominous in the days following the destruction of my antenna system. What had started as a tropical depression in the Gulf of Mexico was rapidly intensifying into what meteorologists were calling a historic storm event. The National Hurricane Center issued their first watches and warnings, and emergency management officials began activating disaster response protocols. I sat in my now silent radio room, staring at the empty equipment racks where my transceivers had once provided vital communications links. The coaxial cables that had connected to my antenna system dangled uselessly from the walls like severed arteries. Without my antenna, the radios were nothing more than expensive paperweights. My phone rang constantly with calls from emergency coordinators asking about my station's operational status. The county emergency services director called personally to confirm my availability for storm communication support. David, we are looking at a potentially catastrophic event here, he explained. The storm models show a direct hit on our area with sustained winds over 120 miles per hour. We need every amateur radio station operational and ready for extended emergency communications. I had to deliver the devastating news that my station was no longer operational. The antenna system had been removed by HOA enforcement, leaving me unable to participate in emergency communications networks. The silence on the other end of the phone spoke volumes about the impact of this loss. You are telling me that an HOA removed emergency communications infrastructure 3 days before a major disaster. His voice carried a mixture of disbelief and anger. Do they have any idea what they have done? Unfortunately, Karen and the HOA board had no understanding of what they had destroyed. To them, amateur radio was just a hobby that interfered with their aesthetic vision. They could not comprehend that emergency communications were the invisible backbone that kept communities alive during disasters. The National Weather Service began issuing increasingly urgent warnings about the approaching storm system. Computer models showed the hurricane making landfall directly over our area with unprecedented intensity. Storm surge predictions exceeded anything in recorded history. Wind speed forecasts were reaching levels that would turn common objects into deadly projectiles. Yet life in Meadowbrook Estates continued with an eerie normalcy that bordered on denial. Neighbors went about their daily routines as if the approaching catastrophe was someone else's problem. The illusion of suburban safety and modern infrastructure invincibility remained unshaken. Corinne herself seemed completely oblivious to the approaching danger. I saw her working in her garden, planting fall flowers as if she had unlimited time to enjoy them. She waved cheerfully when our eyes met, apparently pleased with her recent victory over my unsightly antenna system. The irony was almost unbearable. While Corinne celebrated her triumph over emergency communications infrastructure, that same infrastructure was desperately needed to coordinate preparations for what was shaping up to be the disaster of the century. I spent those final peaceful hours trying to find alternative ways to participate in emergency communications. I contacted other amateur radio operators in the area, hoping to coordinate backup communication plans. But most of the effective emergency stations were beyond the range of portable equipment, and the approaching storm would make mobile operations extremely dangerous. The amateur radio emergency networks began their final preparatory exercises, testing communication links and verifying operational readiness. I listened helplessly on a handheld radio as stations across 3 counties confirmed their ability to provide emergency communications when the storm hit. When they called my station, I had to report not operational due to antenna removal. The silence that followed my report was filled with the unspoken understanding that a critical communication link had been lost at the worst possible time. Emergency management officials made their final public warnings on television and radio. They emphasized that once the storm arrived, emergency services would be unable to respond to calls for help until conditions improved. Citizens were advised to shelter in place and rely on amateur radio operators for coordination with outside emergency services. But thanks to Corinne's crusade against unsightly structures, our neighborhood would be cut off from those emergency communications when we needed them most. The approaching storm was about to prove that property values and aesthetic standards meant nothing when survival was at stake. The barometric pressure began dropping as the storm moved closer to landfall. The air felt heavy and oppressive, charged with the electricity of approaching violence. Even the birds seemed to sense what was coming, abandoning their normal routines to seek shelter. In less than 24 hours, Corinne would understand exactly what her victory had cost our community. The storm arrived with a fury that exceeded every forecast and shattered every prediction. What the National Hurricane Center had classified as a Category 4 hurricane intensified to Category 5 status just hours before landfall, bringing with it winds that screamed at over 160 miles per hour and a storm surge that rewrote the geography of our coastline. I huddled in my basement with my family as the hurricane's outer bands began raking our neighborhood with devastating force. The sound was unlike anything I had ever experienced, a constant roar punctuated by the crash of falling trees and the metallic shriek of roofing being peeled away from homes like tin foil. My battery-powered weather radio provided a running commentary of destruction as the storm made its final approach. Weather spotters reported complete communication failures across the region as cell towers toppled like dominoes and landline systems were severed by falling debris. The normal infrastructure that Karen had assumed would always be available was being systematically destroyed by nature's relentless assault. All conventional communications are down across the affected area, the emergency broadcaster announced over static-filled airwaves. We are relying entirely on amateur radio operators for coordination between emergency services and affected communities. Citizens in need of emergency assistance should attempt to contact local amateur radio stations. The irony was devastating. At the exact moment when our neighborhood needed emergency communications most desperately, the amateur radio infrastructure that could have provided that vital link lay in pieces in a demolition company's scrap yard, destroyed by Karen's aesthetic crusade. The hurricane's eye wall hit our area with catastrophic force just after midnight. The sustained winds reached levels that turned everything outside into deadly projectiles. Street signs became missiles. Roofing tiles became shrapnel. Even small branches became capable of penetrating walls and windows. The power grid failed immediately and completely. Utility poles snapped like matchsticks under the hurricane's assault. Transformers exploded in showers of sparks that briefly illuminated the chaos before being swallowed by darkness. The electrical infrastructure that powered our modern suburban existence simply ceased to exist. Cell phone service disappeared as tower after tower collapsed under the storm's incredible force. The towers that remained standing lost their connection to the broader network as fiber optic cables were severed and switching stations flooded. The communication systems that Karen had claimed would always be available proved to be fragile and helpless against nature's violence. Emergency services found themselves completely cut off from the communities they served. Fire departments could not receive calls for help. Police could not coordinate rescue efforts. Medical services had no way to reach victims or coordinate with hospitals. The invisible networks that connected our modern world had been severed, leaving individual communities isolated and helpless. But amateur radio operators with proper antenna systems and backup power continued operating throughout the storm. Their signals cut through the chaos and darkness, providing the only communication links between devastated communities and emergency services. They became the nervous system of disaster response, coordinating rescue efforts and relaying critical information. Our neighborhood, however, remained silent. Without my antenna system, we had no way to contact emergency services or coordinate with other communities. We were completely isolated, cut off from the outside world by Karen's successful campaign against emergency communications infrastructure. The hurricane raged for 8 hours, battering our community with unprecedented force. Houses lost roofs, windows, and sometimes entire walls. Flooding from the storm surge turned streets into rivers and basements into death traps. Trees that had stood for decades were uprooted and hurled across the landscape like missiles. When dawn finally broke, the devastation was beyond comprehension. Our neighborhood looked like a war zone. Debris covered every surface. Power lines lay twisted and broken across flooded streets. Houses that had been pristine examples of suburban perfection were now shattered remnants barely recognizable as human dwellings. Karen's house had lost most of its roof and all of its windows. Her carefully maintained garden was buried under debris from destroyed homes 3 blocks away. Her silver Mercedes was crushed beneath a massive oak tree that had been hurled across 2 properties by the hurricane's winds. But the physical destruction was only the beginning of our nightmare. With all conventional communications destroyed, we had no way to call for help, no way to report injuries, no way to coordinate rescue efforts, No way to let the outside world know that our community existed and needed assistance. Other neighborhoods with functioning amateur radio stations were already coordinating with emergency services, reporting damage assessments, and requesting specific assistance. But our neighborhood remained silent and invisible to the outside world, cut off by Karen's successful destruction of our emergency communications capability. People began emerging from their damaged homes, looking around in shock at the devastation. Injuries were common cuts from broken glass, bruises from flying debris, and worse. Mrs. Henderson from across the street had a serious head injury that clearly needed immediate medical attention. The Rodriguez family's youngest child was showing signs of shock and trauma that required professional care. But we had no way to summon help, no way to report our emergency needs, no way to participate in the coordinated disaster response that was already beginning in communities with functioning amateur radio communications. As I surveyed the destruction of our neighborhood, one thought kept running through my mind with bitter clarity. Every injury that went untreated, every rescue that was delayed, every death that could have been prevented was now Karen's responsibility. Her crusade against unsightly structures had left our community completely isolated in our hour of greatest need. The disaster response teams arrived 12 hours after the hurricane passed, and their reaction to discovering our communication blackout was immediate and professional anger. The incident commander, a veteran emergency manager named Captain Rodriguez, surveyed our devastated neighborhood with the sharp eyes of someone who had seen too many preventable tragedies. "Where is your amateur radio emergency coordinator?" he asked me as I approached his command vehicle. "We have been trying to reach this area for hours, but received no response from local stations." I explained the situation, how the HOA had forced removal of my amateur radio station just days before the hurricane, leaving our neighborhood completely cut off from emergency communications networks. Captain Rodriguez's expression darkened as he grasped the implications. "You are telling me that local officials removed emergency communications infrastructure 3 days before a Category 5 hurricane made landfall?" His voice carried the controlled fury of a professional who understood exactly what that meant. "Do you have any idea how many lives that decision has cost?" The answer became apparent as the disaster assessment continued. 3 residents had died from injuries that could have been survivable with timely medical intervention. Mrs. Henderson had succumbed to her head injury after hours without emergency medical care. 2 elderly residents had died from heart attacks brought on by the trauma and stress of being trapped without hope of rescue. Captain Rodriguez immediately launched an investigation into why our neighborhood had been excluded from emergency communications networks. When he discovered that an HOA had deliberately removed amateur radio infrastructure, his professional composure finally cracked. "This is criminal negligence," he stated flatly. "These people destroyed life safety systems out of aesthetic concerns. They are directly responsible for preventable deaths." Karen emerged from her damaged house as the emergency teams established their command post in what had been our neighborhood's main intersection. Her perfectly styled hair was now matted and disheveled. Her expensive clothes were torn and dirty. The confident authority she had wielded so ruthlessly was gone, replaced by the lost confusion of someone whose world had been turned upside down. She approached Captain Rodriguez with what remained of her demanding attitude. "Excuse me, when will power and phone service be restored? We need to contact our insurance companies immediately." Captain Rodriguez studied her with the cold assessment of a professional who had just discovered criminal negligence. "Are you Karen Phillips, HOA board member. Yes, I am. And I demand to know why emergency services took so long to reach our neighborhood. This is completely unacceptable. The silence that followed was profound. Every emergency worker within hearing distance stopped what they were doing to witness what would happen next. Ma'am, emergency services were delayed reaching your neighborhood because you and your HOA board removed the amateur radio station that provided emergency communications for this area. Your actions directly contributed to the deaths of 3 residents who could have been saved with timely medical intervention. Corinne's face went white as the implications hit her. That is impossible. We removed an unsightly antenna that violated community standards. That has nothing to do with emergency services. Captain Rodriguez's voice became deadly quiet. Ma'am, you removed federally protected emergency communications infrastructure during hurricane season. The families of the deceased residents will be informed that their loved ones died because local officials prioritized aesthetics over life safety. The news spread through our devastated neighborhood like wildfire. Residents who had supported Corinne's crusade against my unsightly antenna now understood what their aesthetic priorities had cost. The woman who had been their champion for property values had become the person responsible for preventable deaths in their community. Corinne's transformation from neighborhood enforcer to community pariah happened with stunning swiftness. People who had applauded her victory over my antenna system now crossed the street to avoid speaking with her. The social isolation she had imposed on me became her own punishment, multiplied by the weight of preventable deaths. Within 48 hours, my antenna system was fully restored with community support and HOA approval. Emergency communications were reestablished, and our neighborhood rejoined the coordinated disaster recovery effort. But the damage was done. 3 families would forever know that their loved ones died because aesthetic concerns outweighed emergency preparedness. Corinne Phillips had learned the hardest lesson possible about the true purpose of amateur radio emergency communications. Sometimes justice comes not from human courts, but from nature itself.